Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's February 15th, 2025. We're feeling pretty good about our predictions here with regards to Trump's cabinet nominations. There are still some outstanding votes to be had, Kash Patel most notably, but the two big ones, the ones that seemed the most contentious going in, both were confirmed by identical 52 to 48 margins. That's RFK and Tulsi Gabbard. And I would maintain that those are the two most contentious votes, probably the two most contentious up to this point. And I would suspect by the time all of the appointments are made and the secretaries and undersecretaries and deputies and all that are put into position, that those two will realistically have been the two toughest to get the managerial class to sign off on and confirm, even though by a strict assessment of the votes, Pete Hegseth was more narrowly confirmed than either Gabbard or RFK was. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. It's a binary question. As we talked about previously, this isn't hand grenades or horseshoes. It doesn't matter how close you get. Either you get in or not. And going forward, I suspect that the skids will be more greased for Hegseth than they will be for Gabbard or RFK. I think there will be more roadblocks put up for the latter two than for anyone else.
Of all the nominees, RFK Jr. faced the most unbelievably unfair, outrageous criticism. I think the gap between legitimate concerns and the accusations that were leveled against him were the widest of any of the nominees. Why do you think that was, Ness? What triggered people so much about RFK? RFK Jr.'s been a Democrat his whole life, and several of his issues are more associated with the left than the right. I'm talking specifically about administrative capture and the influence of corporations and the revolving door and the corruption of campaign donations. Those are all issues that he's trying to address, and yet there's huge backlash on the left against RFK.
Well, to reiterate what I said previously, I think we're looking through a glass darkly here. I don't know if RFK was less likely to make it through than Gabbard was. If I thought anyone was not going to make it through, I would have guessed that it would have been Tulsi Gabbard and that RFK would have been the second least likely cabinet position to be confirmed. I think the reason that the attacks on RFK made the soundbite circuit more and seemed more unhinged is because it feels less arcane to the general public than Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence. Health is something that is right in front of everyone, and because it interacts in their daily lives in such an immediate material way, in a way that the FBI or National Intelligence, the NSA, doesn't. RFK, it's not so much him as a person as it is the nature of the position that he is being confirmed for. If you operate on the presumption, as I do, that none of what happened at the hearings had any bearing on, outside of a potential snafu, outside of a potential real gaffe, a real flub that would have tanked RFK. Outside of that, if you take the view that none of that mattered, I think that it makes sense that the critics were so harsh because it redounded to their benefits to come across that way. There's a lot of soundbite and social media value in coming down harshly against RFK in a way that will galvanize popular supporters of people like Elizabeth Warren, in the way that attacking Tulsi Gabbard about some spying questions just can't have the same realized effect in terms of getting people the base of people who support someone like Elizabeth Warren. To psychoanalyze it, when you're putting the modal Elizabeth Warren supporter down on the couch and they are she's trying to justify why she feels so strongly in favor of the vaccine schedule that she went through or that she put her 1.5 children through. The rhetorical attacks launched by Elizabeth Warren against RFK, implying that he is doing it for the money and that he is susceptible to conflict of interest because he doesn't actually believe any of this stuff and he must be a bad actor. That is exactly what the modal Elizabeth Warren supporter wants to hear, and she wants to feel justified in feeling the way that she does, and the righteous anger that somebody like Elizabeth Warren is able to bring to a confirmation hearing about RFK and about health and fitness and well-being is a lot more easily grasped at a visceral level than anything that goes on in Tulsi Gabbard's hearings or Kash Patel's to come with the FBI. And so I think that gets at the heart of it.
And Elizabeth Warren receives a lot of money from Big Pharma. So this could be, these hearings are theatrical anyway. This could be an opportunity for her to signal to her donors that they need to keep the money flowing and that she'll stick up for them. And so to that point, I'm going to play a clip from the Senate confirmation hearings for RFK February 4th, 2025.
Stated, this is not only about a private company that gets sued and has to pay out. Vaccine manufacturers often operate on very slim profit margins. If they get sued repeatedly and successfully, they simply move out of the vaccine space. We've already seen this happen with vaccines in the past. 20 years ago, we watched vaccines just move away if they did not have protection from these kinds of lawsuits. The consequence of Mr. Kennedy's ability to make those lawsuits easier is also the ability to shut down access and manufacturing for vaccines for every one of us. And I think
This is coming from the same woman who's champions the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which operates ostensibly to protect consumers from big companies. She doesn't seem to be concerned about profit margins in that situation, but I guess for a different big business, she does. And furthermore, the CFPB operates, a lot of what they do is litigation. They sue big financial institutions. So her outrage against litigation seems selective.
Yeah, I think you're giving her too much credit. I think her concern about whether or not something is too litigious is contingent entirely upon whether or not she views them as a friend or an enemy. In the case of her donors, those are friends. And in the case of a general, more abstract idea of protecting consumers from companies that produce things in ways that are dangerous, that is a lot broader and a lot less concentrated in terms of who she is going to tick off by supporting something like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Big Pharma buys politicians for a reason, and if this isn't a strong reason for why you buy a politician, the potential installing of RFK as HHS secretary, then I don't know what is, because there is a not totally unrealistic risk that if he does delve deeply into the science of vaccines, such as it is, and more importantly demands that the tests of previously approved, currently existing vaccines, if he demands that the tests be done to show that they are safe and effective, as their advocates always claim, well, we've heard about the replication crisis in just about every other aspect of the sciences. both the hard sciences and the social sciences. The social sciences is a little less surprising, but even in the hard sciences, that a lot of these beliefs that are generally regarded to have empirical grounding don't actually have that sort of strong empirical grounding. There shouldn't be any concerns in a theoretical sense against running tests where you know what the outcomes are going to be. Go ahead and run the tests and make them open source, peer reviewed, and show once and for all that the people who have concerns about the vaccine schedule, the regimentation that people in the West, specifically in the United States, Americans go through, where by the time they get out of high school, they've had somewhere on the order of 70 vaccinations that they've received if they follow the CDC schedule. If that's all in the up and up, and even though that the implementation of that regime of vaccinations has corresponded, it seems, with a drastic decline in the physical and mental health of the American population, if that correlation is not indicative of causation at all, and in fact the causation and correlation are at odds inversely, if that is really the case, we would expect to be the case if they're safe and effective, well, then you run the tests and it'll show that to be the case, and it will squelch any of the insinuations that this is not the case. It will squelch those.
I imagine, like, to your point, Ness, that the C-suite at Pfizer watched that with happiness, and they said that was a good ROI. The money we gave Elizabeth Warren, Pocahontas, good choice. The other thing I wanted to mention too that I forgot to mention before, another reason why the left could, if they were acting in good faith at something they could agree with RFK Jr. on, would be the environmental issues. He spent a good chunk of his career cleaning up the Hudson River and devoting himself to environmental law, which again is something that you would think Democrats would be supportive of.
The average Democrat, just like the average Republican, I think is supportive more than anything else of their social status, and RFK is not someone that they are supposed to like. And so even though he is pro-choice and he has a long and storied career of environmental advocacy, and that he's a member of the most famous Democratic family, Big D Democratic family in American history, despite all of that, a poll that was just released this week shows that 74% of Democrats have an unfavorable view of RFK, compared to just 14% who have a favorable view of him. For comparison purposes, consider Marco Rubio, and per Jeff's suggestion, instead of cluttering the airspace up with a bunch of numbers, I'll just speak about net favorability when we're looking at favorable and unfavorable viewings of people and issues and positions. So with RFK, as we just talked about, among Democrats, RFK has a negative 60 net favorability, or an unfavorability rating of 60. Marco Rubio, in contrast, who, if his beliefs are taken in isolation, he is a militarily hawkish Christian conservative. That is an anti-communist. That is what Marco Rubio, that's how he defines himself. That's his political brand, effectively, which down the line doesn't mesh at all with anything that the average liberal Democratic voter would say that they support. Whereas virtually all of the social positions, they would be on the same page as RFK on. And yet Marco Rubio only has a negative 46% favorability rating among Democrats. So he does 14 points better than RFK does. And that's not in the past, that's right now. And to a large extent, I think it's because these people are taking cues from the top. The people who self-identify as Democrats in particular are status conscious, and RFK is portrayed in the corporate media and among institutions of power anywhere that the managerial class has any sway. RFK is viewed less favorably than Marco Rubio is viewed. And that is essentially all you need to know to understand why people who, if you take the positions that they say they support in isolation and compare them to the stated positions of Marco Rubio and RFK, that they would be simpatico with RFK on 95% of them and with Marco Rubio on 0% of them, that still they view Marco Rubio more favorably than they do RFK because of status considerations.
So, Ness, do you think it's RFK as a person, or is it the job that he's being nominated, that he's been appointed for? What I mean is, if RFK had been appointed to lead the EPA, would Democrats have a more favorable view of him because presumably he would be advocating for environmental issues that liberal Democrats say that they care about? Is it that because he's going to HHS, specifically on the vaccine issue, that's the vaccine, especially since COVID, since 2020, the faith in capital S science, one of the core tenets of that faith, which many liberal Democrats subscribe to, one of the core tenets is that vaccines are good and that you're a heretic if you question the efficacy of vaccines. And they will, if you bring up that you've had negative effects from any vaccine, specifically the COVID vaccine, it's remarkable how dismissive people are and how, frankly, how cold and uncaring they are when they hear direct evidence. They'll either deny it or downplay it, or just it doesn't compute for them.
It's the person, not the position. RFK has been made persona non grata by the managerial class and consequentially by the people who get the opinions that they hold. They take cues from the managerial class and from the cultural creating heights of society. He's become an enemy to them, and so it doesn't matter what position he is put in, he's going to be viewed that way because he has shown that he is not a team player for the administrative state. HHS is what was the most important position that, outside of Trump being a dangerous dictator or potential Hitlerian reincarnate, what was the thing after that Democrats put the most emphasis on in the 2024 presidential election? It was abortion. And here we have HHS secretary, the most pro-choice by far HHS secretary that the Republican Party would ever nominate in a million years, at least seemingly up to this point, on the issue that was most motivational, that the one that was used to galvanize or try to galvanize the most support possible to get Kamala Harris into the White House. And on abortion, they have one of their own in the most important secretary position, most important probably administrative position beyond maybe the president himself, in terms of allowing abortion access at the federal level. And yet, again, the Democrats view RFK less favorably than they do Marco Rubio. That is the same Marco Rubio, of course, that the Susan B. Anthony pro-life organization, the largest and most salient pro-life organization in the country, gives a lifetime A+ rating. Rubio is as pro-life and anti-abortion as a mainstream political figure gets. And RFK is far, far on the pro-choice side of things.
There's also a class traitor aspect to this. I think part of the vitriol that both Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. face is that the reason is because they were former Democrats and that they're essentially not playing the role that they're supposed to be playing. So Marco Rubio, although he's a Republican and on paper Democrats would have a lot more disagreement with him than with Tulsi Gabbard or RFK Jr., Marco Rubio is playing the expected role. He's not coloring outside the lines. He's predictable, but RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard are not.
Yeah, the managerial class, the establishment, has roles for all of its public-facing figures, and Marco Rubio has always been a heel, not a heel that they are seriously threatened by, but that's the role he plays. If you think of it in like WWE terms, he is supposed to be the respectable, likable enemy who takes the falls when the falls need to be taken. And that was the position that he had received, and that is the position that he has faithfully abided by to get as far as he has. In the case of RFK and Gabbard, they also had their rules. RFK was a legacy role that was given to him whether he was chosen or not. And in the case of Tulsi Gabbard, she was, as we mentioned previously, she was like AOC before AOC came onto the scene. She was clearly going to be groomed to have a position of high celebrity, high notoriety in the managerial class setup as a leading member of Congress on the Democratic side of things. But she went off the reservation just like RFK did. And so, again, at the risk of repeating ourselves over and over again, beating a dead horse completely into oblivion, what their stated beliefs are and the things that they say they support or don't support, it doesn't matter. If they play the role that they're supposed to play, then they're going to be treated well and they're going to be taken care of. And if they don't do that, then they're not going to be treated well and taken care of. And they'll be, as Jeff alluded to, the sense of betrayal will be that much more visceral when it was people who were really given good positions, good roles to play, and spurned those good roles. They're like viewed as a bunch of ingrates. Somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, she was going to have everything made for her, and she dared to go against that. And so they hate her more than they would hate someone that they viewed as lower class, someone who never would have had those opportunities in the first place. In her case, it's like, how did you have this presented to you on a silver platter and you turned it away? We really hate you for that.
I think that's a great explanation, Ness, and a few other figures come to mind. One would be Clarence Thomas. I think he's certainly not playing the role that a black man is supposed to play in America, and that accounts for some really vitriolic, horrible things that people on the left say about Clarence Thomas. Another person that comes to mind is Bernie Sanders for the opposite. He said some controversial things, even for he kind of went off script 2015, 2016 for the issues that he was advocating for, going after Hillary Clinton to some extent, and single-payer health care and things of that nature. We don't need to get into all of his issues, but at the end of the day, he played ball. He got behind Hillary Clinton ultimately, and so that's why he is still in good standing with the managerial class. Next topic, Mayor Eric Adams, mayor of New York City, it was just announced by the Trump administration, the Trump Justice Department, that they're not currently going to pursue the bribery federal case against Eric Adams. And I don't believe the case has been dismissed, or if it has been dismissed, there's nothing preventing the charges from being brought again. So it's kind of like a sword of Damocles hanging over Eric Adams' head right now, where at any time the Southern District of New York Attorney's Office could bring charges, could bring the bribery charges again against Eric Adams. And the Trump administration said, I believe explicitly, that the reason they were not going to pursue the charges is because that would impede Eric Adams' ability and New York City's ability to cooperate with the Trump administration in carrying out deportations. And so several top prosecutors at the Southern District of New York have resigned in protest because they do not believe that there was any legitimate legal basis for dismissing the charges. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about why these bribery charges were originally brought against Eric Adams. They were brought by the Biden administration. And there is a theory, I would say, on the right that the reason the charges were brought in the first case was because Eric Adams was not playing ball when Biden's invasion was flooding into New York. And he actually raised legitimate concerns. And he said something to the effect of, this will destroy New York City. And so he was, again, referencing what we were talking about before, he went off the reservation a little bit. He wasn't playing the role he was supposed to. A black Democratic mayor of a liberal city like New York City is supposed to play ball with the federal government, especially on an issue like immigration, and Eric Adams didn't. And Eric Adams was actually a few days ago was on Fox News sitting right next to Tom Homan. It was almost like a power play where Homan was basically saying, I mean, I don't think this is very subtle interpretation, but it's that the Trump administration is saying, yeah, we'll take these off your plate right now. We're not gonna throw you in prison right now. But if you give us any resistance as far as letting ICE, for instance, Eric Adams has said that the Trump administration can use Rikers Island to house illegal immigrants. So the Trump administration is basically saying, if you play ball with us, you don't have to worry about these charges. But again, like I mentioned, these charges could be brought again at any time. So I would describe it as a sword of Damocles hanging over Eric Adams' head.
This is an illustration of the Trump administration putting interests over principles into play. I scoff at the idea. It seems so risible to me, the idea that there would be people who would resign in protest over the charges being dropped. Without getting into too many details, much lower, less glamorous charges that I bring forward in my professional life that get dropped all the time because there's this thing called prosecutorial discretion that leads prosecutors to drop all kinds of things and decide not to pursue all kinds of potential legal avenues that they could pursue for 1,000 different myriad reasons. And so the idea that this is the one time that they've ever seen justice not being blind and some sort of political favoritism taking place is laughable on its face to me.
You think the left would be celebrating. Here we have a non-violent black man who no longer has the threat of going to prison. But I guess this is one black man who they want behind bars.
You're saying that tongue-in-cheek, of course, but it does underscore the point we were making previously about how it doesn't matter what their professed beliefs are. It matters what they do and whether or not they stay in line. And if they step out of line, there are consequences for them doing so. And up until this second Trump administration, the campaign for the second administration, not the second presidential campaign. I'm not talking about the 2019-2020 presidential campaign, but the 2024 presidential campaign for Trump to return to the White House when he received the elite insurgency defection support. Up until that point, this sort of tactic would have worked and somebody like Eric Adams would have been hung out to dry. But now that doesn't work the same way because there is a faction of the managerial class, of the deep state, of the elites that have defected from the broader line, and we are seeing the continuation of that internecine conflict that we started to see the outlines of in the 2024 presidential campaign with people like Elon Musk and Bill Ackman and Mark Andreessen and much of Wall Street and much of the venture capital world and the elite money that is behind both of those things, getting behind the MAGA movement with, again, the parenthetical inclusion of Israel as part of that MAGA movement, but with the ascension of the MAGA movement, that the space that has created for elites is allowing people like Eric Adams, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is effective, if the insurgency is effective. This is how elite theory plays out, that you have what starts as a couple of high-profile people defecting, and over time it turns into something like a crescendo cascade where more and more people see that they can break ranks, and the consequences of breaking ranks are not nearly as devastating as they had been in the past, that you could see more people like Eric Adams, who for whatever reason, either because they made mistakes and they've fallen out with the managerial class that backs them, or because for some reason of conscience, or just the feeling that this has gone too far, whatever the case might be, that if they defect, that now there is a welcoming home for them, one that does not necessitate penury and pariah status. And I think that someone like Trump obviously is always aware of the optics. And so I think when you allude to the intentionality behind showing Tom Homan sitting next to Eric Adams on Fox News is not something that just happened accidentally. That is very intentional, and it's showing that there is another power base for people to move towards.
To your point about it not being as costly now for elites to jump on the Trump train, that definitely has filtered down to us plebs, to where now it is much more socially acceptable to be an open Trump supporter than it was in 2015, 2016, where wearing a red MAGA hat was, in some places, genuinely put you in danger in the United States. Not so much now. Now, I still certainly wouldn't go walking around with a MAGA hat in San Francisco, but a lot of places in the United States, you're probably going to be fine versus you might not have been 10 years ago. So hopefully this will lead to some tangible positive developments as far as mass deportations. And it also made the Eric Adams is up for re-election this November. So the president or the mayoral New York City election just got a lot more interesting. And also one other thing I'm wondering is you've got Kathy Hochul in the governor's mansion, and then you've got Letitia James as AG of New York. So I wonder, and they have signaled that they are certainly not happy about these charges being dropped. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't know if there would even be jurisdiction, but if some state charges were brought against Eric Adams, or if Kathy Hochul as governor of New York, I certainly don't know the intricacies, but she might have some leeway as far as appointing or dismissing New York City officials. So I just wonder if any of those top Democrats in the state government will move against Eric Adams.
As far as optics are concerned, we can certainly hope for that, because there are scarcely two better adversaries that you want the Trump administration to go up against in terms of generating sympathy for the MAGA movement than Hochul and Letitia James, who are two of the dumb in the case of Kathy Hochul and vindictive in the case of Letitia James. There are no two people more deserving of being on the business end of the ascendant MAGA movement, trying to make an example at the state level, than those two. Speaking of shifting power factions and insurgency elite movements, with South Africa back in the spotlight thanks to Elon Musk, we have this dynamic at play at the international level. Effectively, what is happening is white Afrikaners are getting the benefit of the MAGA/MIGA movement striking back against the government of South Africa. South Africa has been the leading state in the UN trying to shed light internationally on the alleged genocide taking place in the Middle East against the Palestinians by the Israelis, and the South African government is leveraging the historical apartheid affliction they've suffered. They're trying to leverage that against Israel. And Elon Musk, who is South African himself, has seen an obvious opportunity here to turn that back around on South Africa and show that South Africa's treatment of its Afrikaner population pales in comparison to anything that even Israel is doing to the Arabs that live inside of Israel proper, not in terms of those living in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank, but Arab citizens of Israel, some of whom are members of the Israeli parliament and who, as private citizens, suffer nothing like the legal deprivations and the persecution that Afrikaners, particularly Afrikaner farmers in South Africa, do. And so we have things coming together where white South Africans who, prior to this elite insurgency and the return of the MAGA movement in America, these people who garnered no sympathy at all internationally, the only refugees that you would ever hear anyone from the NGO left ever voicing any opposition to, suddenly their prospects for the first time in decades are looking bright. And that is as a consequence of real political movements at the international level that are taking place that don't seem to directly implicate them, but in actuality do. And if I'm principled, I suppose I'd have to say that both the Palestinian and Afrikaner refugees should be welcome to the West, or they should both be barred at the door. But if I'm more concerned with interest than I am with principles, and I say yes to the Afrikaners and no to the Palestinians. Afrikaner refugees from a racially vengeant South African collapsing state, there are no better spokespeople for the race realist right in the West than these refugees, potential refugees, would be. I feel as though I've come across as much too optimistic and white-pilled on this recording, so we'll close things out with some less encouraging information. Looking now at the Economist YouGov, a series of polling questions about social media responsibility, and the hook here is that we've been talking about Elon Musk and the ascendant elite insurgency and the fame that Elon Musk, outside of just being the world's richest man, what made him such a compelling figure for the lack of satisfaction in the broader Western population, for him to take the lead in the elite insurgency, not just behind the scenes, but also very publicly, was his retaking of Twitter and, to a large extent, restoring it to its original promise. And it's easy to forget that Jack Dorsey called Twitter the free speech wing of the free speech movement before anyone associated Donald Trump with presidential politics at all. This was around 2010, 2011, 2012. That was the promise that Twitter offered and maintained for 3 or 4 years until Trump's first election victory. And Elon Musk brought that back ahead of fusing himself with Donald Trump's political fortunes in his second administration, before he even joined up with the third Donald Trump presidential campaign that would ultimately result in Trump being elected for the second time. And that free speech banner that he runs Twitter under, being celebratory about that is something that is understandable, but it is also worth noting that the idea of free speech on the internet is something that is not broadly popular. It does not enjoy broad public support. It enjoys more now in 2025 than it did in, say, 2020, at the height of the censorship regime during the Summer of Love with George Floyd and the tail end of the first Trump administration, but the tepid support that free speech enjoys in 2025 relative to 2020 would be utterly dwarfed by looking back at 2015. So in 2025, we are in a situation where the public is modestly more supportive of free speech than they were in 2020, but far, far less so than they were in 2015. A decade ago, the idea of social media platforms canning people's accounts for political positions would have been unthinkable. It would have been something that would have seemed so out of place even on the broad political left, that the reclawing that has happened over the last 5 years is akin to taking one step forward after having been pushed 50 steps backwards. And to put some numbers behind this, a poll from January of this year of 2025 asking whether or not social media companies have a responsibility to, quote, prevent users from harassing others on their site, unquote. 76% say yes to just 13% saying no. On the question of preventing users from, quote, spreading conspiracy theories or false information on their site, unquote, 61% say yes, social media companies should be doing that. 24% say no. And on the question of whether or not social media companies should, quote, prevent users from posting hate speech or racist content on their site, unquote, 70% of the population says yes to just 18% saying no. And to the response, well, who defines what is hate speech? And that's all in the eye of the beholder, and all of those types of arguments that I am partial to, it's worth taking a grim look at reality and understanding that the vast majority of the population is not going to go into that sort of depth. They're going to simply hear the corporate media and the managerial class and all of the cultural shaping institutions of power declare that X, Y, and Z is racist and hate speech and a conspiracy theory and misinformation. Ergo, it is up to the social media companies to censor all of this stuff, and they're going to have vast public support behind them in so doing. And so all it will take is a little bit of stumbling by the ascendant MAGA movement, the Trump administration. I think, as we've mentioned previously, I think that we're in for some rough waters economically. I think that could be the catalyst, but whatever it is that stops Trump's early, admittedly impressive momentum, and I think there will be something or confluence of things that will do that when that happens, it will not take much for things to revert back to where they were before, where censorship is the order of the day and the free flow of opinions and potentially controversial information could be as much a thing of the past as it seemed like it was in 2020.
Speaking of Elon Musk, he's obviously been appointed head of Doge, and he's gone after USAID, and apparently has his sights on the education department. But something that I've noticed, and I think he's been very effective so far, one thing I've noticed that the media, the corporate media and the Democratic Party, which are the same thing, have been, their line of attack has been trying to play on Trump's ego by making the claim that Elon Musk is the real president. And they're even, when Elon Musk was in the White House, the Oval Office the other day, and he was standing up and Trump was sitting, they were trying to portray that as Elon being in the dominant position. It was just ridiculous. They're very clearly trying to drive a wedge between Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And you can understand why they would take that approach, because Trump has a huge, enormous ego, and certainly in his first administration, that tactic, I think, worked to some extent. But I think Trump has changed a lot. He's gotten a lot wiser as far as politics go, and knows how Washington works. And it doesn't appear that he's falling for it. So this week, Elon Musk and Donald Trump sat down for a joint interview with Sean Hannity on Fox News. So here's that clip.
You're both aware, you have to be keenly aware, that the media and the punditry class, not that, I think you've proven they have no power anymore because they threw everything they had at you and they didn't win. And that was, the New York Times, Washington Post, 3 networks, every late night comedy show, 2 cable channels. They threw everything, lawfare, weaponization. Sure. And now I see they want you two to start, they want a divorce. They want you two to start hating each other. And they try, President Elon Musk, for example. You do know that they're doing that to you.
Oh, I see it all the time. They tried it, then they stopped. That wasn't, they have many different things of hatred. Actually, Elon called me. He said, they're trying to drive us apart. I said, absolutely. They said, we have breaking news. Donald Trump has ceded control of the presidency to Elon Musk. President Musk will be attending a cabinet meeting tonight at 8 o'clock. And I say, It's just so obvious. They're so bad at it. I used to think they were good at it. They're actually bad at it, because if they were good at it, I'd never be president. Because I think nobody in history has ever gotten more bad publicity than me. I could do the greatest things. I get 98% bad publicity. I could do, outside of you and a few of your very good friends, it's like the craziest thing. But you know what I have learned, Elon? The people are smart. They get it.
Yeah, they do, actually.
They get it. They really see what's happening.
Yes.
We'll wrap it up there. Thanks for listening to The Reality Taboo. Talk with you next time.